Lorelai, fun to see your face.
Okay, babe. Okay, everybody. It is right at noon, and I am uh, Janet Savia put a funny in there. So glad I made it. I overslept. Um, that's funny, Janet. Okay. If you want to go ahead, we'll go ahead and get started. Feel free to stay on mute. You're welcome to be on the camera. You can be off the camera, totally up to you. You're welcome to ask questions. So feel free to ask any questions that you may have in the chat as well. This is more informal, but we want you to get some good information and have the opportunity to talk to Dr. Kristin Daley if you have any questions. So feel free to do that, and we'll go ahead and get started, and I'll continue letting folks in as they pop in.
Fantastic. So I'm happy to be able to be here. My name's Kristin Daley. I started my career, my undergraduate degree was in biology, and I initially planned to go to med school, but had a lot of fun at Chapel Hill. And so I had to work on my GPA to get accepted. And the way I was trying to do that was I was hired into a research job at the big hospital in Charlotte, and my research job was in sleep. And ever since then, it kind of took my career in a whole different direction. So I have a PhD in clinical health psychology, and I have worked in sleep medicine in a lot of different environments. I was a person who did sleep studies at night. I ran a sleep center for many years. And so I love being able to talk about sleep, and it's just been an area of expertise that I have. I'm a fellow of the Society for Behavioral Sleep Medicine. I chaired the clinical practice committee there. And so what I thought I would do is just talk a little, like kind of give some of the key points in some of the areas that I work in. My hope is that we can also just have some fun discussion. And if anybody has any unique sleep questions, or they even have to be unique, I'm happy to answer them. So let's get rolling. One of the things that is really kind of interesting about sleep medicine is it hasn't been around as a discipline in medicine for super long. So what is really neat about being in the sleep field is the people who wrote all of the original textbooks in sleep, for the most part, are still around. They're still at the meetings. And one of the things that's really fun about this is we're constantly learning. And that makes it fun, but also a little bit on the challenging side. I often will say that sleep research is a lot like nutrition research, where one day you'll hear like a glass of red wine is really good for you. And then the next day you hear, no, it's terrible for you. And sleep is a little bit in a similar vein, where there's a lot of information out there, and not all of it is great. To put it in perspective, the American Academy of Sleep Medicine did a survey of all of the books that were written on sleep that were available at Amazon. And this was back in 2010. So you can imagine this is probably very, even more updated now, but only 50% of them were written by people who had any sleep training. And so what is a little challenging is that there's a lot of information out there. And not all of it's great. So I'm going to try to have us focus on the stuff that I like people to know. One of the things that I always like to start with is, why do we do this? Like, why do we sleep? And what we do know is that if we sleep deprive any animal, it will die. So definitely sleep is necessary to sustain life. For the most part, people can last about 12 days without sleep before they really fall apart, but usually we don't get that far. And there are a couple of theories that are kind of relevant to sleep that I always like to touch on. So one is the adaptive theory, and the adaptive theory says that if you look across animal kingdom, you will see that most animals have a sleep pattern that reflects their order in the food chain. So I actually was like at Petco last night with my youngest child, who, although we have a menagerie in my house, is always advocating for the next pet. And lately she's been trying to work the rodent angle. And I was trying to explain to her that there's just no way we're maxed out in animals in the Daily house. And then she was looking at all of the descriptions of the different rodents, and she was like, Mom, all of these are nocturnal. And I said, yes, because unfortunately, prey animals, because they are so low in the food chain, they tend to have a pattern where they are active under the cover of night. And then during the day, they find a safe place to tuck away and sleep. And so also do not make great pets. And so obviously we're predators, so we get to be active during the day and we sleep at night. And so what we tend to see is like our level of status is associated with our sleep pattern. The next theory that has been used to understand why we sleep is the energy conservation theory. So what we see is that if you look again across animals that have very fast metabolisms like mice, tend to sleep about 22 hours a day. So they sleep a lot because their metabolism moves so fast. And when we're asleep, we're not metabolizing calories nearly as much. And then elephants that have very slow metabolisms, they tend to sleep about 3 to 5 hours a day. So their metabolism doesn't need nearly as much rest because their body processes food relatively slowly. This doesn't unfortunately translate person to person. So you can't kind of say, oh, I have a fast metabolism for calories, so I probably am going to sleep more, or vice versa. It's really across animals, different animal species, not individuals. So then the next theory is the restorative theory. And so this one is when we really started to understand how like the brain is controlled through neurotransmitters, and that, the brain itself has its own metabolism. And what we recognize is when we are asleep, metabolism in the brain is slowed down. And basically what's happening is neurotransmitters have the ability to kind of get taken back up, reprocessed. And so one of the pictures we often will have of sleep is that, especially when we are in deep sleep, which this prior slide was a picture of what deep sleep looks like. But when we are in deep sleep, the brain gets flooded with cerebrospinal fluid. And this is the brain's opportunity to really sustain metabolic health. So basically, it's like if you imagine a dirty sponge and you fill it up with water and wring it out, this is kind of what happens when we are in deep, slow wave sleep. Our brain uses this to be very protective of brain health. The last theory is really a fun one, and this one is that sleep is an opportunity for our brain to both program information and reprogram information. So if you ever, depending upon your age, so 20 years ago when I would run a sleep lab, we had computers that, and sleep files are really big data files. And so we were constantly creating big data files and then having to delete them off the computers, which meant we had to do this thing called defragging a hard drive. I don't know if anybody ever had to do this, but basically what happens is the hard drive gets to get rid of bits of information that are no longer being accessed, and it kind of just makes sure that it's nice and cleaned up. And our brain does this exact same thing, particularly with rapid eye movement sleep. So REM sleep is when we do our dreaming. And what happens during REM sleep is if you look at the brain waves in REM, they look the same as when we are awake with our eyes open. So our brain is actually processing a lot of information in REM. And part of it is programming that information so it's accessible to us. So if we learn something new and we're given the opportunity to go into REM after we learn that new thing, we're going to have a lot easier of a time accessing that information. This is why sleeping after you study is pretty important for you to be able to retain that information. Reprogramming is, to me, the part that is even more fun, because basically what happens in dreaming is we tend to process a lot of emotions in dream sleep. And so our brain also will clean out the closets of memory. So it kind of checks, do we care about this thing or can we chuck it? Like, how important is this tidbit of information? And what I often will say is, if you didn't remember it, then maybe your brain decided it wasn't all that important, But usually if you wake up and you wonder, why were these song lyrics in my head? It was basically your brain's way of saying, does she still care about this, or can we chuck it? Like, how much do we need? How much space do we want to dedicate to song lyrics? And so a lot of times people will ask questions about, I had a dream of this thing the other day. Why did it show up? And typically what I will say is it likely showed up for one of two reasons. One, it might have been connected to the emotionality that your brain was trying to process. Like, if you're having a really stressed out time, your brain is you're going to have stressed out dreams as your brain is taking the opportunity to work through those emotions. The other thing is, it might have been your brain saying, like, do we care about this, or how much do we let go of it? So, if you have that dream of the guy you dated back in high school, it might be your brain saying, do we want to hold on to any more of this information, or can we let go of it? And clearly, if you remembered it, you cared about it, and it's staying. So that, to me, is kind of the fun part about dream sleep. So this is a chart from the National Sleep Foundation. There are actually two big sleep organizations in the US. So we have the American Academy of Sleep Medicine, is who does, like, they're in charge of my board certification. They're the ones who manage the practice of sleep medicine in the country. And then we have the National Sleep Foundation. And the National Sleep Foundation is our consumer organization. So basically the National Sleep Foundation is supposed to take information from the American Academy of Sleep Medicine and translate it to consumer information. So this chart is a good example of what we get from the National Sleep Foundation. The thing that I always like to have people look at is there is a wide range of what is considered normal when you think about the amount of sleep that we need. So look at newborn. The low end of normal for a newborn is 11 hours per night. And then the high end of normal for a newborn is 19 hours per night. So that means that you can have a difference, newborn to newborn, of 8 hours of sleep per 24-hour period, and both are still normal. We have a wide range in the amount of sleep that we need. Now, if you look at adult, what I always like to point out is the average amount of sleep that an adult gets is about 7 hours per night. That's the normal metabolism for sleep for an adult. If you look at this National Sleep Foundation graphic, what you will see is they have 7 to 9 as the normal range, and then 10 is at the upper end and 6 is at the lower end. And what I will say is the range of normal for most adults is actually 5 to 9 hours. So, and with 7 being the midpoint, that is the normal amount. The hard part is that the number 8 hours of sleep per night, is a number that initially was promoted because it was mathematically easy. If you think about a 24-hour day, if you have 16 hours of wakefulness, 8 hours of sleep, all of our mathematical models are pretty and easy, and it made everything pretty simple. And then what happened is, I don't know if any of you guys remember the 80s and the 90s, but we went through this period where it was really not okay to value sleep. And when I first started in sleep medicine, there was a Charlotte Observer article. It was a cover article about the top cardiothoracic surgeon at the hospital. And one of the things that he was quoted as saying was that anybody who sleeps more than 4 or 5 hours a night is really just wasting their time. They're lazy. This is like, I'm too important. I'm a person who's going to always make sure that I do what's needed. And so there was a big backlash in sleep medicine saying, like, how do we get people to value sleep? What do we do to make it very important to them? And so that is where they really cemented on the number 8. They recognized 7 as normal. And what they did was they kind of said 8 is aspirational. If we set it a little bit higher than what is normal, what we're going to do is encourage people to be able to sleep more. And that's going to make sure that they value sleep. And that's wonderful if you are a person who thinks that, you're going to sleep when you're dead and 4 or 5 hours a night is really okay. And you're purposefully compressing your sleep or curtailing your sleep. It probably is good for you to have a message that you should be sleeping more. Where it's problematic is I work in insomnia. And what I will tell you is in insomnia medicine, what we often see is our folks who struggle with insomnia typically are in that lower range of normal for metabolism. And so some of them, and we have had it demonstrated that 5 hours per night can be a normal metabolism for sleep for an adult. But if you are a 5 hour sleeper and you have been listening to different publications, or you look this up on the NSF, or I will say one of my least favorite people is Matthew Walker, who wrote the book Why We Sleep. He has a British accent and he does a TED Talk, and he opens his TED Talk about sleep, talking about how if you are sleeping less than 8 hours per night, you are going to get dementia, you are going to get cancer, and if you are male, your testicles are going to shrink. And the problem is the data he is using is not great data. Again, sleep research, I always kind of say, is like, it's like nutrition research. It's not going to be really clean, perfect research. And there's a lot of money in scaring people about their sleep. So I always want people to recognize, try to understand when you're thinking about whether it's your sleep or somebody you're working with, the first thing you want to try to identify is what is their normal metabolism for sleep, because it's not going to be one size fits all. And I always tell my clients, please stay away from Matthew, because, just because he has a British accent doesn't mean his information is great for you. We have to figure out what is your unique metabolism, and that's what we work with. So how do we do that? Typically, what we will do is we will keep a sleep diary for about 2 weeks, and we'll look at a 2-week period of time. A lot of us have sleep trackers available. I like people to use sleep trackers for short periods of time to understand what their metabolism might be, and then to step away. Because one of the big challenges with sleep is you're never going to consciously control it. You can think it's important, you can value it very highly, and often the more you care about it, the more you try to prioritize it, the worse sleep becomes. And so I want to get a snapshot of what your sleep pattern is, and then I want you to step away. I always tell my clients, I want you to, that smart watch that you love, I've got one on, I want you to charge that at night. I don't want you to wear it to bed, because I just don't want you to care about what happens once you've made it to bed. Everything you do during the day, if that thing is tracking all your steps and your workouts, that's wonderful. That's amazing. Don't worry about trying to control what happens when you go to sleep. One of the first sleep tracking devices was something called the Zeo. And when the Zeo first debuted, it was at one of the big meetings of the American Academy of Sleep Medicine. And so they gave a lot of these like trial devices to different sleep professionals at the meeting. It's like that was their big debut. And what was neat about it was you put 2 electrodes on your forehead, and it was really accurate. Like it was really good. It could estimate what sleep stage you were in with these electrodes. Wonderful data. Obviously, I don't think anybody on here has ever heard of the Zeo, and here's why. It had a fatal flaw. What it did was it gave you a grade on your sleep based on what it recorded. And so you can imagine all of these professionals who are all these super overachievers, who, by the way, we all think we nail sleep because this is what we do for a living, are suddenly getting C pluses or B pluses on sleep. And that was completely intolerable for people. And so then what happened is you got a C in sleep, you tried to figure out what to do to make it better. And by trying to make it better and control it, sleep got even worse. We often will jokingly call that Fitbit-induced insomnia. And that is because, like, once you start tracking something that maybe you didn't track before, you can become a lot more aware of it, but that awareness doesn't always benefit you. So we are always advocating, figure out what your number is, make sure your time in bed pretty closely matches that number, and that's really all I ever want you to care about. So to highlight a couple of factors in sleeping well, because I feel like it's good for us to cover this. So I already mentioned, learn your metabolism, know what your unique number is, and know that it's going to be different, potentially even from your bed partner. So I am a 7-hour sleeper. And if you look at my specific data from like my Apple Watch or Fitbit, it's probably slightly shy of 7, but 7's a pretty rough, good estimate. My husband is one of those 5-hour sleepers. That's how much his brain can do at night. And so we have a 2-hour difference in our metabolisms for sleep. And it's important for us to match up our time in bed pretty closely to our metabolism. So let's go back to that 5-hour sleeper, and let's say they watched Matthew Walker's TED Talk and they're really worried. What they will do is they'll try to sleep 8 hours because that's what Matthew says is right. And what the brain does is it will take that period of time in bed and it will divide up your capacity for sleep over the time of available resources of time in bed. So what happens to that 5-hour sleeper is some nights they might fall asleep quickly because they're tired, but then they're going to wake up a lot during the course of the night and even have like long awakenings at night. And in the morning, they will have slept the 5 hours that they typically sleep, but it's going to have occurred in this very broken fashion, which makes them feel pretty cruddy. And so what happens is the more our time in bed doesn't match our metabolism, the more we're going to experience wakefulness in bed. And so we used to categorize insomnia, like many years ago, we had like what was called early insomnia, which meant you had trouble falling asleep at the beginning of the night. And then we also had this other thing that we would call terminal insomnia, which didn't mean you were dying from insomnia. It meant the insomnia was happening at the end of your sleep period. And we had this other fun thing that we called DIMS, which was disorder of initiating and maintaining sleep. All of those categories are gone now because what we recognize is it doesn't matter if you're waking up at the beginning of the night, middle of the night, end of the night. It is all wakefulness during the night. And so a typical intervention for this is we restrict time in bed to what your metabolism for sleep would be. Now, when I'm working with clients, one of the things I understand is we also see that when we estimate our time in bed, our estimate can be off as much as 25%. And so what I always like to do is I like to pretend that this person can be, that they're off by that 25%. And so usually I will start with 7 hours per night as the time in bed that I have people restricted to. So that's what that is doing is it's kind of creating a little bit of pressure on your metabolism, but it's not so strict that we're creating some real anxiety about sleep. Because my goal always is to make sleep as relatively like least anxiety producing possible. So let me see, like Mark's asking, are there any reliable sources that scientifically test and evaluate the accuracy of various sleep trackers? Yes. So one of the big arguments has been, so the American Academy of Sleep Medicine does estimates of their accuracy. And the challenge is to get the best estimate, we have to take that data and compare it to a nocturnal sleep study, which is a pretty expensive test. So what they typically have done is they look at what we can say is most of the sleep trackers are accurate in the 85 to 90% category. And that is only if you're looking at the total amount of sleep. They're not great at identifying sleep stages. So whenever people bring into me, like, why do I have like too little REM sleep or why do I have too little deep sleep, I always say like the challenge can be just the way the sleep tracker is designed may not pick up the actual like sleep staging very accurately. So usually we can look at, it's a pretty good, 85, 90% estimate of accuracy, but that's about as good as it gets. Yeah. So somebody else said, yeah, my sleep tracker has no idea. And the hard part is what the sleep trackers really are monitoring is your heart rate. And in particular, most of them use a thing called heart rate variability, which is looking at changes in your heart rate. And they are kind of translating that as sleep stages. And that's not going to be super accurate. So the hard part is that if you're inactive and your heart rate is nice and low, your variability is down because you're in a very restful state, it's gonna score that as sleep, and that's going to be the challenge. So I usually set a 7-hour time in bed for most people when I'm starting to work with them because I like to pretend that everybody could be average, and then we see what their brain does with it. And that's normally where we start. I see people in 2-week intervals. And the reason why I do 2-week intervals is anytime we make a change to your sleep pattern, we're going to see the outcome of that change around day 7 to 10. So sometimes my clients will call this like being on Dr. Daley's sleep diet, which I don't always love it being viewed as like a diet. But the thing is that similar to diets, like if you make a change to your diet, you're not going to see the outcome of that change the very next day. It's going to take a little bit of behavioral consistency before we see that outcome. The good news is that for sleep, it's only about 7 to 10 days. Our brain's desire for eating and food consumption is a lot more complex of a system, and that can take forever to manage. So it's a whole different animal. So, and I saw there's a question about sleep apnea, and I will be happy to answer any questions about sleep apnea. I don't have any specific slides about it, but we can address it. Schedules are good. One of the things that we see is that if you have more than, say, an hour of variability between the time you fall asleep day to day, that actually translates to problems with having a higher BMI. So it actually tends to make your body mass higher if you have a lot of variability to your bedtime. And that's independent of total sleep time. And, like the amount of sleep doesn't even matter. The other thing is that if you have more than an hour of variability to the time that you wake up, what will actually happen is that influences the way that your body utilizes insulin. So we see greater insulin resistance when there's a lot of difference between the time that people wake up for the day. One of the things that, so you will, things that you will hear that I would love to demystify is like that people sleep in like 90-minute chunks or 120-minute chunks or 110-minute chunks, and that you should kind of divide up your time based on these like cycles of sleep. We do go through different sleep cycles at night, but it's actually more of a global pattern spread out through the course of the evening. So the first third of the night is mostly deep, slow wave sleep. And so that's when you're pretty unconscious. That's when your brain gets all that metabolic benefit of being flooded by cerebrospinal fluid. Middle third of the night is a mix between slow wave sleep and rapid eye movement sleep. And then the last third of the night is mostly rapid eye movement sleep. What's fascinating about REM sleep is when we are in REM sleep, because our brain is so busy and active, it turns off all of our ability to move our muscles. So we can have this dream that we are fighting a bad guy, but we're going to lay perfectly still. If anybody has any pets, you know that that mechanism doesn't work perfectly in pets. They will bark and their legs move and everything else. But us humans, we have a really strong mechanism. And so what happens is waking up out of REM is a little bit tricky. It doesn't feel good. Like every sleep lab in the country, like we all had a policy, never wake a patient out of REM. And the reason is not because anything bad is going to happen, but because they're going to feel pretty bad about how they slept that night. So if you just wait for them to transition out of REM, they're going to feel much more well rested. And our brain does this for us. So if you typically wake up at, say, 6 a.m., starting at about 5:30 a.m., your brain is going to start to release some alerting neurotransmitter to help suppress REM sleep and make sure that you are ready to go when your alarm goes off at 6 a.m. So by having consistency with your wake time, we're actually helping you to feel more well-rested in the morning. And it also works with your insulin metabolism as well. So these guys, we have a central clock in our brain, but every organ in our body has clock genes. So I have a question about, circadian rhythm disorders. So, oops, oh no, there it went. So the thing about circadian rhythm is this is genetically controlled. So I am a natural night owl who's married to a natural lark. So my husband naturally wakes up really early. I did great in the sleep lab because I loved being a night owl. My younger brother, who's in his mid 40s, he is a musician, so he still gets to live as a night owl. Most adolescents and young adults are naturally night owls. And then what happens is when people hit adulthood, usually due to work or parenting, but for some reason, we end up having to be on a much more normalized schedule. And then as we age, we have a tendency to what's called phase advance, where then we become LARPs, where we want to go to bed at 8 p.m. Like we want early bird special dinner at 5 p.m. We'll be asleep by 8. I have a client I just saw yesterday who's on this schedule. She is always asleep by 8 a.m. and she is always awake for the day at 3 a.m. And that is a normal phase advance schedule. But of our 3 children, 2 of our children are night owls, and one of them is a lark. Our oldest is actually naturally a lark. And when he was a kid, we used to have to set an alarm, and he had to stay in bed until his alarm went off. Because if he had any light exposure in the morning or any activity, his brain would think that was a time when he was supposed to wake up. So we always had to keep him in bed in the dark until the alarm goes off. And similarly, that's often how I'm going to work with my folks who are larks who don't want to be waking up so early. So what happens is that waking time sometimes becomes entrained. So there's another question about, I typically wake up at 3 or 4 a.m. How do I get back to sleep? One of the things that happens is if you have anything that tells your clock system that maybe you were supposed to be awake, it's going to repeat those awakenings. So what I often am doing is we try to figure out how do we make sure you're not going to have any wakeful cues during the night, so we can teach your brain to be able to sustain sleep during that period. And I actually have that on the next slide. So here's how we do this. Your primary clock system in your brain is driven by receptors in the back of your retinas that are called your retinal Zeitgebers. Zeitgeber is literally German for time giver. And what these receptors do is they are constantly picking up the amount of light that is in your environment. So light is measured in a unit called lux, and bright full spectrum sunlight, like we have outside today, is about 10,000 lux of light. When you're out in bright full spectrum sunlight, what happens is these retinal receptors are super, super stimulated. And through being very stimulated, they're facilitating the production of serotonin in your brain. So serotonin is your antidepressant neurotransmitter. And we all need about 30 to 60 minutes every day of bright full spectrum sunlight for our brains to adequately produce serotonin. So if you've ever wondered why Seattle has the highest rates of depression in the US, it is because 330 days of rain every year is not great for our circadian system. It doesn't help facilitate serotonin. What's interesting is when the pandemic shutdowns first happened, what we saw was it looked like insomnia went away altogether. It was like the craziest thing. All of a sudden, nobody's struggling with insomnia. And what was happening, I don't know if you guys can remember, but a lot of people were like going outdoors for walks on a daily basis, like no longer stuck in an office all day. So just starting to engage with being out in nature. And all of that sun exposure is the thing that really facilitated this. And then, of course, as the pandemic wore on, people became less active, and then we saw everything start to creep back. So one of my instructions to my folks is I always need them to make sure that they're having 30 to 60 minutes a day of bright full spectrum light exposure for their brains to help facilitate their serotonin production. And we need that because in the evening, when the sun goes down, these receptors that have been stimulated during the day are going to become inhibited. When they become inhibited, the brain takes the serotonin that's been being produced during the day and metabolizes it into melatonin. Melatonin tells your brain it's dark out. So a lot of times people think of melatonin as like the sleep onset hormone. And it's important to know that's not what it actually signals. What it signals is my environment is dark. So you give melatonin to those nocturnal animals and they're going to get busy because their brain knows this is the cover of night. This is time for me to be active. We sleep at night, so our brain knows melatonin levels rising mean it's about time for us to go to sleep. We have an initiation of melatonin exposure, and then about 2 to 3 hours later, we have what we reach a kind of a peak melatonin rate. And what that does is that facilitates the release of the neurotransmitter GABA, and GABA is what actually makes you go to sleep. So what I always tell my folks is if you want to really understand circadian rhythm super easily, think about what life was like in caveman days and mimic it. So in caveman days, nobody wore sunglasses. We had tons, all of our work was outdoors, tons of light exposure. And then we would go sleep in caves. I don't know if any of you guys have ever been in a cave before, but if you do a cave tour, their favorite thing is to turn out the lights. And caves are pitch dark. And so what I've discovered, so often I talk to my clients about sleeping in the dark and the importance of it. Because we have very thin eyelids. And so the challenge is that if you have ambient light in your sleep environment, that will actually passively suppress your drive for sleep. It affects your sleep staging and your sleep continuity at night. And so what I want is I want people to be in the dark for the entire period that they hope to be sleeping. Now, what I've learned to do is I ask my clients at night, when your eyeballs have adjusted to the dark, please hold out your hand and make sure you can't see it. If you can still see your hand once your eyeballs have adjusted to the dark, you're not in the dark. You have way too much ambient light, and we've got to make that go away because that is disruptive to your sleep pattern. The other thing that becomes hard is, let's say you do fall asleep in the dark, but then you get up and you go to the bathroom during the night. And on the way to the bathroom, you have a light exposure. Retinal receptors receive that light. And what they do is they suppress melatonin, suppress GABA, and entrain your brain. This is a time we are supposed to be awake. And what happens, so a lot of my folks who use the restroom periodically, if we can get them to stay in absolute darkness for their entire sleep period, trips to the restroom go away. And that is a really key factor. People think that their bladder tells them to get up, but it's actually an entrained awakening that tells them to get up. So going back to the question about what do I do at 3 or 4 a.m., one of the big things I want is really for you not to know it's 3 or 4 a.m. because you're absolutely in the dark. Like the challenge is, so like there's a question about blinds, does it interfere, and also like versus setting an alarm. I was giving this talk recently, and I don't know if anybody has ever heard of these. Like, there are alarm clocks that project the time on the ceiling, and those, to me, like when somebody invented those, they basically increased my caseload by a good percentage. The challenge is having that constant exposure to time and light exposure creates disruption. So there's another question about cell phone use and computer use before bed. What's really tough with that is if you have a phone in front of your face, you have a light source in front of your eyeballs, and it's not enough to produce serotonin. Like, at some point, they're going to come up with cell phones that can do 10,000 lux of lights. At the very least, it's a serotonin producer, right? But what they actually do is they're going to passively suppress that circadian drive that's supposed to trigger our sleep cycle. So I always have my recommendation for my clients is like at least an hour before desired sleep onset. I need them to get far away from any light sources that are going to be 18 inches from their face. So I always say, I don't care about a TV because a TV typically is across the room. Now, for my adolescent clients who don't watch TV, but instead watch things on a laptop, that's going to be challenging because that light source is very close to their eyeballs. And so the thing with using blinds at night is chances are there's way too much light leakage that's going to create challenges with circadian rhythm. There's actually a study, I just did a talk for the Carolina Sleep Society. And there was a really interesting study that was done in Asia where they looked at complaints of insomnia and the frequency of these complaints relative to light pollution in these different cities through Asia. And what they could see is it was really neat. They did this like geolocation of people posting on social media about their insomnia. And there was this very strong relationship to the areas that had the most light pollution, which they actually measured on satellite, were the ones who also had the most people who were struggling with insomnia. So this is an ongoing issue. The best thing you can do is give yourself full darkness the entire course of the night. So obviously, like, I don't want people walking into walls during the night. Like, I don't want to get an email like, hey, we've had this bad feedback from, people are getting black eyes. But what I want you to do is I want you to think about where is the light source. So when I give this talk to folks who are in elder care, like, one of the things that we will talk about is using a flashlight to guide their way versus a nightlight, because I want you to imagine, I don't want the light source to be focused towards your retinas. If you're behind a flashlight, then you are behind the light source, and it's not going to have the same impact on your circadian system as when that light source is directly focused towards your eyes. So even with little kids, like we always kind of coach them how to get comfortable in the dark. And we want to make sure that they're not using night lights for soothing, because that's one of the big challenges with sleep disruption in kids. Okay. The other thing to know about caves is caves are pitch dark. Caves are also very cold. And the recommended temperature for sleep is about 65 degrees. Range between 60 and 67 degrees, but normally 65 is a sweet spot. And that is always bad news here in North Carolina, because right now it's okay. Though I will tell you, like a week like this, where, the low last night was 45 and the highs are in the upper 70s. What's hard is most people don't want to turn on their air conditioning when the high is like 75 and it's still March. But what can be tough is it may be pretty warm in their bedrooms when they go tonight. So I have actually just today had two former clients reach out and say, all of a sudden I'm having a tough time this week. And I know this is temperature driven. It's warm at night. Their bedroom is probably too warm. And that is the thing. And it always happens when we have these first warm weeks, there's going to be a struggle. And a similar thing happens in the winter too, where we're having this transition. But if we can make the room cold, it is going to help your circadian system regulate your sleep. Your head is the only thing that needs to be cold. There are lots of great devices that are really expensive that are sold that will chill your mattress. And what I will say is the mattress being cold is not really the thing that your body needs. It is your head being cold. One of these days, I need to change this graphic. So to a text exchange I had with my husband recently, he had gotten the power bill that was like your annual power bill, and he was like, he texted me and he said, our annual power bill is $840 more than it was last year. I don't know what's happening. And I responded, menopause is hard on everyone. Like the challenge is that the temperature piece as our hormones change, the temperature piece becomes even more critical. But we need to make sure head is in a cold environment. You can be as warm as you want from the neck down. Too hot and sleep do not go together. So there's been a lot of research about whether or not weighted blankets will be helpful. And the thing that we always run into with weighted blankets is it's pretty hard to find a weighted blanket that doesn't also make you hot. And heat and sleep do not go together. So it's such a really simplistic intervention, and you would be surprised how impactful it is. So I'll hit on two more points before I stop and make sure that we hit on questions. But one of the things that if there's anything I would love for you to walk away from this talk with, A, be in the dark, B, don't expect to sleep 8 to 9 hours. Most people don't. And then C, please don't clock watch at night. So what happens is when you check the clock at night, there is basically a neurological response that gives this feeling of control. If I ask my folks who struggle with insomnia what a happy time to see the clock is, what an angry time to see the clock is, they can always tell me. And the metaphor I like to use here, so this is one of my dogs. I promise you I follow all of my own rules, and you can imagine how fun it is to be in the Daley house because everybody in the Daley house gets to follow all of my sleep rules, And the thing is that, so I keep my dogs crated at night. One time the dog was barking in the middle of the night, and and so I figured she must be sick. There must be something wrong. I let her out. And then she was running around our yard barking, which was, I'm like, my neighbors are going to kill me. So I shook the treat bag to get her back into her crate. And then that was great until the next night. And then what I recognized, what she had learned was I bark in the middle of the night, I get a treat. This is amazing. And so what I had to do is I was like, we got to break this habit. And the way we break this is we've got to stop letting her out and giving her treats. And the first night, she's very persistent. The first night, she barked for a good almost 2 hours. Second night, it was more like 45 minutes. Third night was about 15. Then she was done. And this is what it looks like when we're trying to break that relationship between time checks and sleep. I just had an interaction with a client earlier this morning that was, he was saying, I've noticed my awakenings are starting again around 3 or 4 a.m. I'm also starting to need to use the restroom. What do you think is happening there? And my immediate response to him was, how do you know it's 3 or 4 a.m.? Because I know that we've talked about the fact that you don't need to know what time it is during the night. And to me, all of this is related. So what I always will say is get in bed, set your alarm, and be done with it. And make it, if you have to, move your alarm to a place that there's no way that you can check the time. Because it's not your rational brain that is active during the night. It's your irrational emotional brain that is active during the night. There's a whole research group out of Penn that calls it the mind after midnight. And just so you know, the mind after midnight is not super rational. And so what I usually will say is move it someplace where you can't see it. And then what you will know is that when you're hunting for it, that's your break. That's your thing to tell you, don't look at the time. It doesn't matter. I know I usually have my clients set an alarm so that going back to the question about sun rising versus alarm, I like to have my clients wake to an alarm because I'm asking them to stay in bed in the dark until their alarm goes off. I'm training their brain to be able to sustain sleep eventually to that time. And so I need them to be able to be inactive and resting in the bed. The alarm is their cue. Okay, I can finally get out of bed. If they don't like the sound of an alarm, what we'll do is we'll put a nightlight into an outlet timer. And that's another way. Like if the nightlight turns on, then I know it's an appropriate time for me to be awake. But you now have this like very simplistic binary assessment. Like if I wake up, if the light's not on, then I stay in bed and I rest. Notice I'm saying this, and this is going to conflict with almost anything you would see in the media. Because what does the media say? If you're awake, get out of bed, go do something else until you feel tired and get back into bed. That recommendation came about in the 1960s. If you think about what life was like in the 1960s, we didn't have a lot we could do in the middle of the night, and our lights were a lot dimmer. Now, you open up your refrigerator and you're getting blasted with LED. And what we're recognizing is that recommendation, although it was meant to eliminate stress, the association of being stressed in bed, if you work as a therapist, we know how to handle, like tolerating being in environments and learning how to change the stress. What's hard is if you get out of bed and do something else, you're teaching your brain this is a time we're supposed to wake up. And so this is actually something in Society for Behavioral Sleep Medicine, we're working to really shift the frequency with which that recommendation is made, but it's a slow change because a lot of people like that recommendation. So just so you know, that's when I always change. I'm going to skip this guy. The last thing I would kind of want to touch on is that there is a deep relationship between sleep and safety. We have to sleep. It's vital to our survival. And yet our brain also knows that sleep is an incredibly vulnerable place for us. You are completely unconscious. And if your brain thinks that there is anything that could be a source of stress or could be a risk or a threat, it is doing its job fighting sleep. If you're living in a war zone, it needs to make sure that you can be reactive to any of the sounds that might indicate that you are under threat. So a really fun study that was done, they looked at sleep in adolescents and adults. And adolescents, they can sleep next to a pile of dirty laundry. It does not disrupt their sleep at all. Most grownups can't. This is the other thing that really destroyed sleep during the pandemic was a lot of people were working from home for extended periods of time, and then they set up their home office in their bedroom. And if you happen to have your work computer in your bedroom, and let's say it has little LED lights, but it also makes sound and is like kind of screaming at you, the challenge is you're not going to be able to rest. The other thing that I see a ton with my clients is they're doing body checks, like how sleepy do I feel? If I do X, Y, and Z, am I going to fall asleep? They're always looking for like, how do I control this? Because I'm not sure I can actually trust myself to be able to go to sleep on my own. What we have is we have a couple of sensory associations that our brain utilizes to know that we are in a safe place where we sleep. So if you've ever had that feeling where you're falling asleep and then you jolt, like just as you're drifting off, it's something called a hypnic start. And the neat thing about it is we think that somewhere evolutionarily we might have slept in trees. And the hypnic start was our brain's way of saying, don't fall out of the tree, make sure you're totally safe. It's just a quick check, make sure everything's okay before we totally go to sleep. The more stressed out you are, the more likely you are to have hypnic starts because your brain's like, are we sure we're okay? Because we're about to be really vulnerable here. Your brain uses your sense of smell, your sense of touch, and your sense of hearing to know whether or not you are in a safe place where you sleep. So with touch, we'll actually see people in the sleep lab like reach out and rub their bedding between their fingers. And that is just a sensory check. Am I in my safe place? So if you have bedding that's very soft to the touch, that's nice and reassuring. This picture here is my youngest when she was a lot younger. And all three of my kids have ADHD, but she was the most hyperactive of the three. And so she needed something to kind of push her down for her to be able to sleep. So she has this giant teddy bear on top of her. And that was like our version of a weighted blanket for her. Like it just pressed her down and allowed her to just relax and be able to go to sleep. And most of us, especially those of us with like kind of high wired nervous systems, we do well if we have that kind of proprioceptive feedback, like consistent pressure that says you're in your safe place. But it doesn't need to be that heavy. I mean, I usually recommend to my clients that they just have a nice, pretty sturdy blanket. Again, room is going to have to be cold enough to offset the weight of that blanket. But that's a part of the touch sensation. With smell is subcortical. So your brain wants everything to smell like you, but it has no idea what you smell like. And, or you have no idea what you smell like. But if you like use the same pillow every night, that's all it cares about. If you have a bed partner and you guys accidentally swap pillows, the funny thing is neither of you would sleep as well. And you wouldn't quite know why, but it would be because your brain is like, this is the wrong place. This is not okay. And then with sound, ideally we would be able to sleep in silence, but most of us live in cities and don't have the capacity to have a silent sleep environment. I mean, the funny thing is one of the biggest disruptors in my sleep environment, even though I'm in the city, is we have a big owl that lives in a tree outside of our house. And man, that thing makes weird sounds. And so we use white noise because it creates a nice blanket of sound in the background. It has to be loud enough that it's going to mask all of those background sounds. Like I have to make it loud enough to make sure we can't hear the owl. And the other thing to know about it is when you first start sleeping with white noise, your brain is not going to like it. what we usually see is it takes about 3 to 4 days to get adapted to having sound in the background. So first night that you have white noise, your brain is going to really push back. It's not going to enjoy that sound. But with repeated exposure, it gets entrained. So like I sleep to the sound of chirping crickets. My husband picked this one. And if you play that sound, my brain automatically assumes it's time for us to go to sleep. We have white noise in my offices, and I gave a talk to our clinicians recently about sleep. And it was interesting because a couple of our clinicians realized that they sleep to the same white noise that we have in our offices. And they were like, this is why I'm tired all day long, because I'm in this environment that my brain associates with sleep. So there's a question here, and this is kind of the perfect spot for it, which is about neurodivergence and sleep problems. One of the things that we do recognize, so I didn't touch on supplements, and that's mostly because my goal always is that we're creating a sleep environment that works super well for clients. We're entraining their circadian system, and I don't tend to like to use supplements or anything else because it always just becomes another way that you're trying to control sleep. Whether it is sleepy time bear tea, whether it is magnesium, or whether it is like the sleep supplement, we develop a relationship that this is part of the thing that makes me safe to go to sleep. And so what happens is over time, it will lose efficacy. And so it's better for us to really work on creating things that are kind of sustainable. However, and I will say I have always been a pretty vehement anti-melatonin person for a couple of reasons. One, most of the time, so just so you know, our brain can only metabolize 1 milligram of melatonin. If you look at most supplements, you're going to see 5, 10, 20 milligrams of melatonin. They are way too much melatonin. The other thing is that melatonin, because it is a co-metabolite with serotonin, most melatonin supplements have both melatonin and serotonin in them, and that's completely counterproductive. So serotonin stimulates wakefulness, melatonin is related to dark and sleepiness, and if you have both, then they're kind of negating each other, and that's not super helpful either. So the one place where it has been tested, empirically validated, and proven to be important is with neurodivergence, in particular autism spectrum conditions. So folks who are on the autism spectrum do not reliably produce adequate melatonin to regulate their sleep pattern. And so this is the one place where it has been tested and demonstrated to be beneficial. And what is hard is they tend to metabolize melatonin a little bit quicker. So there are some longer acting melatonins that are used with this population. The other thing that it can be difficult is sometimes the way that people soothe tends to be counterproductive for sleep. So when I work with families who have a child on the autism spectrum, I always have to work with them on how they're using devices as part of the soothing routine. Because again, if they have light exposure in front of their eyeballs, that is not going to help when it comes to regulating sleep. We expect that for neurodivergent folks that their total sleep time may be reduced. They tend to also have lighter sleep stages, and that's where having these environmental cues for sleep can be really beneficial. It helps to create a little bit stronger of an entrainment. But those are things that we anticipate when we're doing that particular work. I had another question about restless leg syndrome. So when we had the meeting for Carolina Sleep, Dr. Andy Spector, who is at Duke, has just written a book about treating restless legs. And one of the things that was really interesting about it is most of the meds that were typically used to treat restless legs we're now recognizing aren't great for people. They're in the Parkinson class of medications, and so there's been a little bit of transitioning. And what really is essential with treating restless legs is trying to find the correct medication. And this is actually a little bit tricky. There are some good medicines, but there's been a transition in that field. And so the question is what do you do when their PCP is kind of trying to intervene or, recommending something simplistic? Because actually magnesium hasn't been demonstrated to be beneficial with restless legs. Restless legs is related to dopamine production in neurotransmitters. And so, and the hard part is most doctors only get an hour or two of sleep medicine training in medical school. I teach at the psychiatry residency for Atrium. And I make sure my psychiatry residents don't leave without having a really thorough education in sleep, because I know they're going to be prescribers and they're going to be on the front line. And a lot of times they don't understand very much at all how to handle it. So it is something where, especially with restless legs, it's totally worth a consultation with a sleep physician, because it's a very specialized treatment. Question about exercise and sleep. That was actually a slide I cut because I can talk ad nauseum about exercise and sleep. But here's the thing, short and sweet. The way I want people to think about exercise is about helping to regulate the body. And the more regulated the body is, the better we can sleep. It's not, don't think about it as, how like in those diet trackers, they'll tell you like, oh, you worked out this much, that means you get extra calories. And we all know that's actually not true, because like the more you burn, the more your body like slows your metabolism to compensate. More exercise does not equal more sleep. It's more about exercise for self-regulation. So I coach my folks a lot on that, like giving their brain the opportunity to be physically active, especially out in the sun, is fantastic. But that's about settling that stress response system. And that's the benefit you see with sleep. For some folks, exercise too close to bedtime will be problematic. But everybody, so I have a client right now where she has some significant circadian rhythm issues. So we're really specifically looking at timing of exercise and its impacts on sleep. Just know that the better regulated the body is, the more capacity for sleep we have. But it's really the goal is not exhausting yourself and increasing sleep. That's not going to be the thing that happens. Question about Ambien. So a lot of the work I do is helping people get off of meds. And the reason why getting off of meds is so important is that what we see is, even if you keep a medication, a prescription, only on an as-needed basis, it is going to increase the likelihood that at 2-year follow-up, you're still struggling with sleep issues. So it's actually a really key part of our treatment to work off of medicines. Ambien, and there are several medicines in the same class, class of medications. They directly replace GABA. They're GABA receptor agonists. Your benzodiazepines are also GABA receptor agonists. They work as fake forms of GABA. And what's hard is, if you imagine, like, let's say you need this much GABA to be able to fall asleep, and you're really stressed out, you're in a high state of alert, so your brain is suppressing GABA to keep you from sleeping because it wants you to be able to be reactive. And then you take a supplement, or you take the medication that now gives you enough GABA. Good news, you get to go to sleep. But because your brain thinks you are in stressful conditions and not safe, what it does is it actually downregulates your own GABA production to compensate for that medication. And a lot of times patients will develop what we call hypnotic dependent insomnia, which is, if you took their medicine away, there's no way they're going to sleep. However, they're not sleeping well with their meds either. And that's when we really have to use a taper process to get people off of medications. And so the main goal always is sleeping well, no meds. And I will say, like, using more of these CBT interventions, 80% of the time we can get there. A lot of it is like, when we start to get to med taper, a lot of that is just coaching people through like learning how to tolerate feeling a little bit more wakeful at night and not panicking. That's kind of the big things that we have to look at. So questions about, calculating sleep metabolism. As I said, I like people my favorite is I use a paper sleep diary, and it's really just, they draw the time they got into bed, time they got out of bed, and shade when they think they were asleep. I always say think. I don't need to turn them into clock watchers. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to just estimate how much, how many hours do they think that they're getting sleep? And that's usually where we start. But I really want it to be based on perception rather than actual physical data, because people get kind of overly in the weeds about trying to have these numbers be specific. And healthy sleep is variable night to night. It is not the same night to night. There's always going to be some variability. So I always start from the beginning, trying to get them comfortable with that. So another question about shift work. So shift work is really, for younger people, our circadian rhythm is a lot more flexible. And so the thing is that most folks can be pretty healthy and do shift work up until their mid to late 30s. And then what happens is, the older we get, the less flexible our circadian system becomes. And so what happens is that becomes overall a lot more detrimental to our health. The best recommendation we can give people who have to do shift work, like, I have a lot of, like, I've had several clients who are ER physicians and they have to follow these shifts, is as much as possible stabilizing those shifts and trying to adapt their lives to match their work schedule as much as is humanly possible. When I worked in the sleep lab, I would always flip back to a daytime schedule when my shift was up, but I was in my 20s. The thing is that if I had to do that now, that would be miserable. And the best thing to do is to really focus on these cues for sleep, light and dark exposure, and making sure that we're really giving ourselves adequate time to be able to learn that new circadian system. This is kind of the neat thing, is that it's very flexible, and so, like, if we really have to stay in a place where we have to be on an odd shift, we can entrain it. It just takes repetition and consistency, which can be a little bit tough. All right. There's a question. Hydroxyzine for sleep in kids, that regulates blood pressure. And it's okay as like a short-term intervention, but most of the times when medicines are started to try to manage sleep, what is problematic is people stay on them for a very long time. Average Ambien prescription runs 7 years, even though it was only tested for the long term as 6 months. And so the thing is that it actually, if you're using that intervention, the goal is that it's a very short-term intervention. So circadian rhythms have a genetic component, or are they wholly based on genetics? So we have a phenotype. So you can either, typically you are either a lark or a night owl, and that's your predisposition. And so the challenge is that that's where your brain's happy place is. And so if you're naturally a night owl, your brain looks for reasons to stay up later. And it really struggles with cues that tell you to wake up earlier. And the opposite happens with people who are more larks. But the thing is that this is a very flexible system. So you can adjust it. You just have to really attend to, and the things that we have people attend to are light exposure, dark exposure. Food is, I didn't have time to get into, but food consumption and timing of food is really a key part of circadian. And then muscle activity. So that's like, if we're working on a circadian pattern, we're usually going to pay attention to all of those factors. Let me skip ahead to, this is a very basic behavioral sleep pattern that I typically will use with people. So, watching a metabolism, dark, cool environment, and then daytime activity, light exposure, physical exercise, anything we can do to try to make sure that we can match metabolism. I'm going to put in the chat my email. I am always more than happy. I know we had some questions about data as well. I am more than happy to send research articles if that's your leaning. I have a whole bunch of them. And, also, if you have any specific questions about sleep on things that I didn't touch on, I'm also more than happy to answer them. Sleep is still a very small field. And like I said, there's just a lot of misinformation out there. So I'd rather, if you have a question, be able to try to point you in the right direction. Just know that there's a lot that I'm happy to provide.
Thank you so much, everybody. So Dr. Kristin Daley has put her email into the chat. Again, it's Kristin@findyourbase.com. If you need it, forget it, you can always reach out to me and I will be happy to connect you with her as well. We did record this, so if you would like to see it again, I need to do a little formatting with it and all that kind of stuff, but we will definitely have that up on our website, hopefully mid next week or so. And again, you're welcome to reach out to Dr. Daley if you would like to for any questions. And your website is?
Yeah, it's findyourbase.com. And we have a couple of health psychologists that work with us. Oops, I don't know what's happening here. I did something wrong. And I have a lot of writings on there, but also if you have I usually will do pretty specific behavioral plans with people. So if you have a client who's struggling and you have a question, I'm always happy to do consultation too. I would much rather coach you how to work through it than try to have to worry about fitting them on my schedule.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, everybody. I hope you have a good weekend. And thank you so much, Dr. Daly, as well.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for having me.
Bye, everybody.
Thank you. This was great. So much helpful information. I realize I'm sleeping a normal amount of time. She was great. Thank you. I don't know how I got on your mailing list, but I'm glad I did.
Very good. That's awesome. Thank you.
Bye. Enjoy your weekend.
You too.
Thanks.